Hi, everyone. My name is Becky Robinson. I'm the founder and CEO of Weaving Influence, and I am beyond thrilled to talk with my friend Whitney Johnson today. Welcome, Whitney.
Thank you, Becky. I am beyond thrilled to be talking to you as well.
So as you're coming in today, we want to invite you throughout today's event to communicate with us in the chat. And what we would request is that you use the drop-down menu to select all panelists and attendees so that everyone can see the wonderful comments and questions that you're sharing throughout today's event. You know, I'm so glad that we made it to another Friday. And one of the things that we've been doing on these daily connection webinars is stopping for a moment to think about what we are grateful for today. So if you can take a moment as you find the chat to use that drop-down menu to select all panelists and attendees, and then take a moment to tell us what is it that you can be grateful about today. Whitney, do you have anything on the top of your mind that you can share with the group about what you are grateful for today?
Yeah, I was just going to type in the chat box. So some things that I am grateful for today is there's sunshine outside. So I live in Virginia in the Shenandoah Valley, and I'm grateful for the sunshine. I'm grateful for the beautiful landscape where we live. I'm grateful for daffodils. And I'm grateful for music. That I just was listening to music this morning, and just how music can just lift your spirits if you're playing it really, really loudly. So yes, I'm grateful for all those things.
Wow, I love that, Whitney. Thank you so much for sharing. I must admit, I'm a little bit jealous about the daffodils here in Michigan. You know, we've been looking for flowers. So far, all we've seen are a few crocuses, and it won't be long. I know spring is on the way. So for those of you who may not have met Whitney before, Whitney is one of the very first clients that we ever had the chance to work with at Weaving Influence, and so good memories about the work that we did together in those early days. Whitney is now the CEO of a boutique consultancy, WLJ Advisors, and she's one of the 50 leading business thinkers in the world as named by the Thinkers 50. She's also an award-winning author, a world-class keynote speaker, and a frequent lecturer at Harvard Business School's Executive Education. She is an executive coach and an advisor to CEOs. So we'll talk more about Whitney's amazing podcast toward the end of the hour and her books, and give you a chance to find those. But for now, we want to dive into the topic of the day. So Whitney, one of your most successful books, Disrupt Yourself, talks about the way that we can advance our careers and take leaps is to disrupt ourselves. And I know that currently we're all feeling a bit disrupted, and it's so out of control. And what I was hoping we could do today is really to dive in and think about the way that we can apply your 7-step framework to dealing with the challenges and changes that we're all facing.
Yeah, okay, absolutely. And I have to say to everybody listening, so Becky, we first launched the book Disrupt Yourself in 2015, and Becky helped us launch that book. So thank you.
Yes.
So just to give you some quick background, I worked on Wall Street. I was an equity analyst. I had discovered this framework called Disruptive Innovation that was developed by Clayton Christensen at Harvard Business School. And it was this idea that a silly little thing can take over the world, like the telephone did to the telegraph, like the automobile did to the horse and buggy. More recently, we've seen Netflix disrupt Blockbuster, and now Uber and Lyft are disrupting cabs. Well, as I was doing this work with Clayton, I had this insight, this aha, that this theory isn't just about products, it's also about people. And so over the last 7 years, I've been codifying and researching this whole idea of, well, what does personal disruption look like? How do you apply all of these ideas to the individual? And so I had written an article in Harvard Business Review called Disrupt Yourself, wrote a book in 2015 called Disrupt Yourself, and it really outlines this 7-point framework. And the basic idea is that the best way for any of us to manage through disruption, through upheaval, through chaos, is to disrupt ourselves. That's how we manage through it. That's how we don't get tumbled by the wave of disruption, but we create something together. And so this 7-point framework is a way for us to disrupt ourselves in a very systematic and effective way. So should we talk through it, Becky? What do you think?
Well, certainly so. But before we do, I'm curious, Whitney, if you've given much thought to this idea of, you know, we're already disrupted. And then you're asking us on top of that to disrupt ourselves more. So how do you make peace with that yourself?
Yeah, it's such a great question. You know, it's interesting because under ordinary circumstances, I would say to people, okay, it's really important that you disrupt yourself, that you try something new, that you step back from where you are so you can slingshot forward. Right now, we're in a time and place where we don't have to actually make that choice because we've all been disrupted. We're all at that launch point of our S curve of learning. And so what do we do with that? And I think to answer your question, Becky, this is one of those things of I can't control the external disruption. I can't control it. I like to think I can, and we all like to think that we can. Can't control it, but we can control how we respond to it. And so that's where the personal disruption comes in, is if I can figure out ways for me to control how I'm responding to this, then I'm going to be able to manage through it. And instead of it being something that is acting upon me, I am acting upon the disruption in a way that I can. So that's how I'm making that how I'm reconciling.
So that's really helpful, Whitney. And I love that idea of, recognizing the things that we can't control and then recognizing that our own response to the disruption, whether it's in our business or in our personal lives, is the part that we can control. So yeah, let's dive into your framework and start by talking about what you mean by taking the right risks.
Yeah. Okay. So whenever I talk about these different, they can be in times of, for the future, you can think of them as accelerants, and for the present, I would think of them as guardrails, and you can think of them on lots of different levels. So take the right risks at its simplest is this idea of there are different kinds of risks. There's competitive risk and there's market risk. And so competitive risk is big opportunity, you got the projections to prove it, you just have to figure out if you can compete and win. And we think about that all the time with our businesses and with products, et cetera. And market risk is where you don't know if there's an opportunity, but there's a problem that you think needs to be solved. You don't have any projections, but if there is a market, there's no competition. So there's that competitive risk and market risk. And what's interesting is that with market risk, when you don't know if there's an opportunity, the odds of your success, according to the theory of disruption, are 6 times higher. So you're probably thinking, okay, awesome. Competitive risk, not so good. Market risk, definitely better. The challenge is that with competitive risk, it feels more certain because you can figure out, yeah, there's a competitor, I'm going to go after that. And so that feels really safe and really comfortable. Whereas with market risk, you're like, well, it's uncharted waters. Like, I don't know what it's going to look like. So even though it's less risky because it's less certain, it feels scarier, which is sort of where we are right now. There's all sorts of opportunities for market risk, but we're looking for the certainty. So the thing that I want you to be thinking about is that you can apply this with your business. You can apply this for you as an individual. Don't always go after jobs that are all about, there's a job posting and 100 people are applying. That's competitive risk. Market risk is problem you think needs to be solved. You've got the skills to solve it. I think I'm going to go after that. So, okay, so that's what it looks like. Now, right now, at this point in time, how does this apply to you? In your brain, there's a competition going on. And the competition is that fear is trying to hijack your brain. That's what's happening. And so that's a lot of competition. Now, how do you compete, or how do you take the right risk in this situation? You focus on market risk, which is focusing on creating. And so you say to yourself, what am I going to create out of this? What is it going to look like? And instead of saying things like, well, I don't know if I can do this, you say things like, I am hopeful for the future. And I bet you, if you said it right now, you would feel like, yeah, I do feel more hopeful. I am hopeful for the future. And so the market risk, or the taking the right risk right now, looks like, how do you think about what you're going to create? And there's a wonderful quote from Bob Proctor that says, amateurs compete and professionals create. And so taking the right risk right now is not trying to compete in this era or this time where everything feels scarce, but instead thinking about, what am I going to create? That's taking the right risks, a guardrail for what's happening in our world right now.
Wow, that is so powerful, Whitney. And I wish that everyone, wherever you're sitting, would just say it with me. It's a little bit goofy, right? But I am
That's
hopeful
good.
for the future,
Good. You got
and I can
to.
choose to create something.
Let's say it together, you and me, Becky.
Okay,
All
okay,
right.
Whitney. Yeah, I am hopeful. Oh, one, two, three. I am
I am
hopeful
hopeful for the
for the
future.
future. I am hopeful for the future. Yeah, I did not align with you very well on that, Whitney. Well, let's talk about the value of playing to our distinctive strengths at this point in time.
Yeah, our strengths are always important, but a couple of thoughts around this is that our strengths do tend to be fairly invisible to us. We talk about blind spots, and usually it's like, oh, it's a blind spot, but like our strengths are blind spots as well. And so one of the exciting things about right now is that because we're in this place of not knowing, and we've got lots of constraints, which we'll talk about in just a minute. When you're in a box, you're like, how am I going to get out of this box? And so you end up relying, when you're in that box, on what you do reflexively well. And the things you do reflexively well are your strengths. So the thing that I would say about this is, right now, just really watch for it. Observe, like, oh, that strength is showing its face. Just be aware of it. Now, a quick clue on how you can know what your strengths are is look for compliments that people give you. Those compliments are a signal of what you do well, because they're saying, I see that you've got this superpower. The second strength that I want you to rely on right now is the fact that there are people in this world. Well, first of all, you have an ability to love. That's your strength. We all do it imperfectly, but we all have the ability to love. The distinctive strength is the fact that there are people in this world that can only feel loved by you. There's a wonderful quote from Marion Scholes, and I'm going to paraphrase it, but he said something to the effect of, we all have the exquisite luxury of allowing other people to feel loved by us. And so that right now is a distinctive strength that you have. It's a way that you can manage through this chaos, that manage through this upheaval, is be aware that you've got these strengths that are going to come out to play that have been hiding, and also be aware that there are certain people that can only be loved by you. That is a distinctive strength, and it's a way to manage through what we're working our way through right now.
Wow, I love thinking of that. And that is something I think that creates a hopeful future. If we can focus on what we can control, and we can focus on the strength that we have, which is that there are certain people who can be loved by us. And I'm thinking of a few that are in my house. They're making some noise. I hope no one can hear them. Well, so constraints, I
Yeah.
know as a business owner, I'm feeling a lot of constraints at the moment. And I'm sure those of us who have joined today are also experiencing some new constraints, like I can't leave my house, or, the money that I have to work with in my business is suddenly, decreased. So how can we apply this idea of embracing constraints
Yeah.
in a unique,
So
in a unique way right now?
yeah, so I guess, just in the spirit of we're all in this together, one of my big revenue streams is I do a lot of speaking, and that's just gone. It's just gone for a good 6 months. And so I think, that's the experience I'm having. Becky, you just shared the experience that you're having. And so I think it's a good time for us to all say to each other, we all know at some level what one another is experiencing. And I think that there is some comfort in that. From a standpoint of constraints, there's oftentimes this idea of, when you're on this S curve, you're trying to move up it, you think, well, if only I had more time and more money, more buy-in, more expertise, then I could really move up the curve. But we know from the law of physics that we actually need something to bump up against. And some statistics that I think are really interesting is that the Kauffman Foundation did a study that said that 51% of all the companies on the Fortune 500 were started in a time of a bear market or a recession, or both. We're talking companies like Apple. We're talking companies like Toll House Cookies. The other thing that they found is that 40% of the Fortune 500 companies were founded by immigrants or children of immigrants. Why? Because these are people who have disrupted or been disrupted by life. And so they've learned how to embrace their constraint. And so and I'm going to tell you one quick story, and then we can keep going, kind of a fun story. So there's a movie that's very famous. It was produced by Steven Spielberg. And He was trying to make this movie. He thought it was going to be amazing, but I want to illustrate the power constraints, which is he didn't have enough time. He didn't have enough money. The mechanical shark that he wanted to use, it didn't work. And so he finally had to shoot the scenes for this film from the shark's point of view and let the music, and we can all sing the music. Becky, can you sing the music for us?
I can't.
Da, 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 da. And I can't sing it very well either, but I'll try. And let our imagination do the rest. And think about it, like if he hadn't had these constraints, it probably would have been kind of a meh movie. But with those constraints, it became a classic. And so the thing that I really want all of us to be thinking about on this is that our constraints actually may be the very thing that we need in order for our business, in order for us to move forward, not only with our business, but for us as individuals. Like, this is an opportunity for us to really rethink who we are and how we want to be and show up in the world. And so to encapsulate this idea, I would say for a disruptor, for a person who can move through disruption, a constraint isn't a check on your freedom. It is a tool of creation. So what are you going to create?
I love that reminder. So what does it mean for us to battle entitlement as we work through this framework?
Yeah, so at its simplest, it's this idea of everyone around us is a person, not an object. And so we treat people like objects when we say, well, I don't think I'm going to get the virus, so I'm going to still go outside. Or we make a decision that when we're negotiating with, so for example, if we have to lay people off, how are we treating them? Are we treating them as objects, or are we treating them as people who have lives and we care deeply about, and showing them a great deal of respect? So the idea of battling our sense of entitlement is somehow believing this idea of, well, why did this happen to me? If we truly believe that we all are created equal, as many of us purport to believe, then our battling entitlement is recognizing or asking the question, well, why wouldn't it happen to me? And finding ways in every single interaction that we have to treat every person, to never preference our emotions or preference the other person's emotions above our own, recognizing that it's people, not objects.
Yeah, that is very powerful right now, and a helpful reminder. So what about this idea of step back to grow, and how is it especially relevant now?
Oh, so relevant right now, because oftentimes we have to make the decision to step back, and we've all been pushed back, like really pushed back, whether it's financially, whether it's how we run our business day to day, whether it's spending lots of time with our children and have them at home, and what does that look like, and how do we do this? The thing that we know from disruption theory, and if you look at this graph that you see up in front of you right now, the idea of disruption is, let's say you're at 10 on the grid, and 4 weeks ago your life was sort of over one, up one, over one, up one. Well, the math behind disruption is that you go from 10 down to 7 because you believe it by making that decision to step back, you can be over one, up 3, over one, up 3, or over one, up 10. That step back can be a slingshot forward. So the way you want to think about it is, as you're embracing your constraints, tapping into your distinctive strengths, how do you take what has happened to you to slingshot forward? And not just with your business, but for you as an individual. How do you use this opportunity to slingshot into who you can be? I think it's so hard right now, and I don't want to diminish it, but there are so many wonderful, exciting opportunities for us to develop as human beings, as well as companies, as a society.
It's a really helpful reminder, Whitney. So what might we need to do during these times to give failure their due? Its due.
Yeah. Well, we all fail all the time. The thought that I have here for right now is this notion of a little bit more compassion with ourselves. I don't know about you, but I will be having conversations with people and I'll be like completely forget what I'm saying, because we've all got cognitive overload. It's like our brains are buffering. And so this idea of just giving each other a little bit of grace, a bit of compassion as we move through this. Something that would be true regardless of the circumstances, that, as I said, we all fail all the time. I have lots of fails, bombing speeches in front of hundreds of people, being fired, investing in businesses that blew up. What I found though is that that wasn't so much the problem. The problem was that I attached shame to the failure, that I somehow made that failure a referendum on me, on my identity, on my sense of self, rather than just saying, okay, so it didn't work. And so now let's figure out what we can do differently. And so what I would say is recognize that the up and the down are part of personal disruption, and that it is shame that limits your ability to disrupt. It is shame that limits your ability to manage through change and chaos. It's not the actual failure, because if you really examine your life, you recognize that you fail all the time. So use this opportunity to reflect and say, okay, I got some shame around that. That means there's something interesting going on here. That means there's an opportunity for me to develop more as a person and a human being. So give that failure its due, recognize that it's an opportunity to iterate, to move forward, and also both from a business standpoint, but also for you as an individual.
So I wonder if there's any opportunity during these times to reframe failure, or I guess I keep going back to what you said about fear and how much fear is controlling us now because there's so much that's unknown. So what do we do when our fear is about the failure that might come due to the circumstances that are happening?
That's a great question. What do we do when the fear is about the failure of what might come? So I guess there's two thoughts that I have there. Number one is that the importance of doing things to not let fear hijack our brain. And there's some simple things. You do things like listening to this webinar and this conversation, as opposed to turning on the news and spending an hour with a lot of people who are oftentimes fear-mongering. I'm not saying don't be informed. I'm not. But one of the ways that you keep that fear at bay is you limit your intake of information that's going to overwhelm you, that you actually have no control over. So that would be a starting point. In terms of the fear of the failure, is to recognize, and this goes to this idea of this is an opportunity for us to figure out how we're going to be more resilient, and say, I don't know what will come, but I also believe that I can figure it out. And this is where you mentioned a little bit earlier, this idea of woo-woo, but I am a big, big believer that whatever we say, there's so much of what we say we can make be true. If we want to say all day long, I'm going to go bankrupt, guess what? Your brain will figure out a way to help you go bankrupt. If you say all day long, I am confident that I can figure this out, guess what? Your brain and your heart will figure out a way to make it through. It just will. It's how our brains work. And there's science to back that up, but I think it's very powerful. So a lot of this is, do we allow our worst fears to become true by talking about them, or do we focus on what we want and think can happen? And again, amateurs compete, professionals create.
I appreciate that so much, Whitney, and I love the confidence with which you remind us to focus on the good outcomes that we can create. So how about this last idea of being discovery-driven? How does this come into play right now?
Yeah, so with discovery-driven, so there was a study done by Korn Ferry that said that the leading predictor of C-suite success was the ability to take a step forward to gather feedback and adapt. So basically dealing with ambiguity. Now, right now we've got a lot of ambiguity. We don't know we don't know what things are going to look like exactly. Even if we have a great deal of confidence for the long term, it's sort of like in the near term, what's that going to look like? Quick story on this. A couple of months ago, I thought, I'm really good at ambiguity. I'm good at discovering my way into the future. And then I was getting ready to interview Brene Brown for my podcast, and I'm like reading through what she says. She's like, let's figure out how good you are with vulnerability, which is basically showing up when the outcome is uncertain. So you're being discovery driven. She said, take this test, talk to your truth tellers, and ask them what you do when you're afraid, when it's uncertain. So I did that with my husband and my children, and they said two things. Number one, you get hypercritical, and number two, you start to micromanage. But really they said you nanomanage. I'm like, okay, bad, need to work on this, definitely need to work on this. But it also gave me these indicators, these signals. And this happened to be just yesterday. Yesterday morning, I was super hypercritical. And I realized I was, because I was getting ready to deliver a presentation. It mattered a great deal to me. And I was like, okay, so what that means is that I am afraid right now. I'm walking into the unknown. So yes, I need to work on it, but good job. because you're walking into the unknown. And so that's what we're doing right now. So when you start to do those things that you're like, oh, not so attractive, it's also giving you a signal that you're doing something hard and you're doing something scary, and you're taking a step forward into the unknown of the future and trusting yourself that you will figure it out. So that's how I'm thinking about being driven by discovery. Again, you're playing where no one else is playing. You're a disruptor, but that belief that you will figure it out.
That is so powerful, Whitney. So I'm curious, for those of you who are listening today, of these 7 steps in Whitney's personal disruption framework, which one is speaking to you the most today? We'd love to hear from you. You know, what are you taking away from today's call that you can immediately apply? And one of the things that I'm taking away is we need to practice again to align on that 1, 2, 3, I am hopeful for the future, because I failed at that one miserably today. So for those of you who have joined us who have enjoyed Whitney as I have in her sense of confidence and positivity for the future, we would invite you to check out Whitney's Disrupt Yourself podcast. I personally am a subscriber. The podcast with Brene was exceedingly powerful. I highly recommend that you find it, download it, subscribe, rate the podcast, do all those things that help podcast guests along. I also invite you to visit Whitney's website at whitneyjohnson.com to find out more about what she and her team are doing with organizations. And finally, I would invite you to buy Whitney's books. I read a statistic this week, thanks to a colleague, that ebook sales over in England with one of the online retailers are up 400%. Well, it's because we all have some additional margin in our days, and ebooks can be instantly delivered. So check out Disrupt Yourself, Building an A-Team. You know, the book that launched my business, Dare, Dream, Do, is also highly recommended. So check out Whitney's work. Whitney, thank you so much for joining today.
Yeah, thank you. I'm delighted to be here.
So folks, we'll be back next week with 5 more guests on the Daily Connection. We hope you'll invite others and join us. As I've been saying every week, my company, Weaving Influence, is available to help you with any digital marketing needs. I will let you know that just today we did something new. We are allowing this disruption to push us in new directions. So we launched a free ebook called Go Virtual. So if you are interested in figuring out how to deliver engaging online events, we invite you to download that ebook for free. Hopefully Sarah has the link. If not, I will include it in next week's emails. And everyone have a great weekend.